Welcome to Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, the President, and welcome to this very special Thought to Action where we delve deeply into important issues, examine ideas, discuss solutions, and put our thoughts into actions. And I'm joined today by our distinguished fellow, Bryan Griffin, who attended CPAC and participated in a number of events that I think have been mischaracterized by the mainstream media. And to go through and discuss some of the high points that I think are both comical as well as instructive. So before we move forward, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our videos. Please make sure that you let people know about us, share the video. Please comment, helps the algorithm. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website, londoncenter.org. So without further ado, Bryan, welcome to Thought to Action. And thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be here to discuss my experience at CPAC 2021.
So, let's jump right into it. What was your general impression of the event?
Well, I think it was an important gathering to happen in the face of the last election. I think there was a circling of the wagons that happened, and conservative policy points were discussed and debated. And what I really enjoyed seeing as a conservative, what made me feel good to see, was that there was a discussion on a range of solutions that conservatives can offer to any problem facing society, even those problems that are claimed to be owned by the left.
Right.
And there was discussion about finding solutions in the free market and public-private partnership, in the individual and the family, and then to a limited degree in government. But as opposed to what might come from a left-leaning version of CPAC, all of the conversation was not focused on policy solutions coming from government. So that was refreshing.
So, I believe that the key issue is finding a path that will enable government to play a role, but not be the central focus of a solution, because frankly, right. I just don't think that's ever really happened, short of a few rare exceptions. So let's go through, first off, the idea of who attended, because one of the things I've found that the media really does try to make this out to be almost like an extreme right, alt-right event, and I don't get that impression. So can you kind of fill in the details of who all was there and what the focus was of the individuals?
Yeah, that's just not true. I mean, there was a number of viewpoints from conservative thinkers across the board. There was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of disagreement. Really no uniformity of thought at the conference, besides the fact that limited government and conservative values are the way to approach problems in society. But you've got people of all different backgrounds, and of course, you had some big high-profile Republican stars. You even had some former Democrats like Representative Vernon Jones on the main stage. But you had also a very diverse crowd. There were a number of women thought leaders, and there were a number of Black conservative thought leaders. Several panels, in fact, were focused on Black conservative thought leaders better making the case to their communities that conservative values can better achieve the things that they care about.
To the point of who attended and the fabric of the conference, my impression was, since I wasn't able to be there, was that this was actually an examination of what could work or should work relating to an actual partnership between private sector, individuals, and groups that can actually contribute to a series of legislative actions that could actually do things to move the economy forward, to reestablish a strong national security policy relating to China. And that actually, what you just said is that the Republican Party is very inclusive. There's no one demographic, there's no one group which seems to be the dominant force. I would almost hazard to say, Bryan, that what you've described is a very populist movement.
Well, absolutely. And there was both proactive and reactive examinations of issues facing us right now. The proactive issues are, what do we do about things that are becoming, the number one issues that Americans face? How do we best tackle COVID? The answer was not grow government limitlessly. Right. It was use the federal system, encourage innovation, the things that I think, that we've seen done. But for the next 4 years, most of the solutions that Americans see to any, pick any topic, the only solutions we're going to see come out of Washington are ones that involve growing the size of the government. So proactively, the issues that face us today, China and their growing size and competitive nature, COVID, the need to bring the economy back to life, these things had a wide variety of solutions being discussed. And then reactively, there was a lot of discussion about preserving and protecting the rights that every American should enjoy as guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. And in fact, there was a panel that focused on each of the amendments of the Bill of Rights and how those rights are being chipped away at by expanding government, unaccountable, unexamined, expanding government, and then how to better preserve those rights for all Americans, not just Republicans, not just Democrats, not just conservatives, but something that all Americans should enjoy are the rights afforded to, enumerated in the Bill of Rights. And then I'll just push on one more topic. There were some interesting new conversations that took place at CPAC, new topics that the conservative movement is going to own in the coming years. One of them is criminal justice reform. After the success of the 2018 First Step Act signed into law by President Trump, there was much discussion about how criminal justice reform is important, and that amendments in the Bill of Rights that focus on the protections afforded to every American when it comes to interacting with the justice system is something that conservatives should own. So it was all very encouraging to see, and it was not what you read about in the papers.
So no, I appreciate the way you frame that, because the London Center, as you know, our work focuses on accountability, on criminal justice reform, on the idea that there must be a systemic integrity to any process, anything from individuals who are wrongfully convicted to integrity of elections. As well as the audience knows, we are big on the Bill of Rights, especially the First and Second Amendment, the Second Amendment being one of our key focus areas. So it's good to hear, Bryan, that those things are abundantly discussed and supported at this event. But let's get more into specifics about individuals, because so much of this, no matter how great the policy is, it seems like so much of the politics of personal destruction come into this. Let's talk about President Trump and some of the media coverage of his speech.
First of all, a lot of the media coverage was focused on things that were simply untrue about the conference. I've heard things talking about conservatives perpetuating these conspiracy theories. A lot of panels specifically spoke against conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
There was a whole host of viewpoints on election integrity itself. Now, of course, election integrity was a focus of the conference. The idea that every eligible voter should have their vote counted and counted accurately is something that supports the institutions of democracy. So it was a topic of the conference.
The audience should note that we were actually working this the last 4 years with very little acknowledgement, and it's funny how we were trying to be ahead of this, but nobody was listening, and now here we are. So just a little plug there, Bryan.
Sure. No, it was a main focus of the conference, and I think it's something on everybody's mind. But there, like I said, there were varying viewpoints on it, the pervasiveness of the fraud, what to do about the fraud. There was a lot of policy prescriptions offered. The discourse was very healthy. Of course, there were high-profile speakers, like you said, including the president, who came in and did his thing. He didn't outright say that he was going to be running for the presidency again in 2024, but he certainly hinted at it. Yeah. And I think that he was an opportunity for a lot of people at the conference to celebrate on what he was able to accomplish, including, by the way, the fantastic job numbers that his economy showed, the low unemployment rates for all sectors of society, and the Abrahamic Accords. All of those successes of the Trump administration were things that were discussed.
Right, which we as the London Center, as a policy center, will continue to work those policy successes. Obviously, that's our interest, is making sure that those great things which were done during those years are sustained or expanded. So that is clearly something you and others within our organization will be working. And it does. I'd like to believe, Bryan, that the very speech that President Trump did, what he said, helps actually pave a path forward for our work in this area.
Well, sure. I think you brought up a lot of topics that are not going to be a focus of the Biden administration, that are pressing issues to American society.
Yeah.
And so just talking about those things in the specific and in the general, was it important? And like I said, a healthy discourse that happened at CPAC. And by the way, part of that healthy discourse were a number of London Center fellows, including myself. We had Tim Furey, a fellow at the conference, and I was able to speak to him about some of his thoughts on topics that were presented at CPAC, and perhaps we can play some of those now.
Well, I'm here with a fellow of the London Center and a friend of mine, Tim Furey. Tim, I'll let you give a little intro and background about yourself before we dive into our thoughts on CPAC.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. So I've been with the London Center for about 2 years. Have been involved in New York City in politics and public policy for well over 10 years now, and I've spent quite a bit of time dealing with issues around economic growth, Second Amendment related issues, crime policy, and other things that involve urban public policy and other related matters.
Great, and what brought you to CPAC this year?
Well, I think this year in particular, after the last election, I think it's very interesting to see where conservatives will be, going from now. Right? I was obviously during the Trump years, and what brought Trump into office in the first place was this kind of this surge of this populist sentiment coming from the right, and that's something that's relatively new over the past few decades. And so now it's interesting to see what exactly that will manifest itself to going forward. What the party will do from a policy perspective to try to galvanize the working class groups that they did that first brought Trump into power in 2016. Of how that will be fine-tuned going forward for new candidates that really want to get involved and maybe not make some of the mistakes that happened during the previous administration.
Our role at the London Center is based on our policy expertise that we've studied and that we work in, but it's also, our role is to, I guess, be the voice of the new generation, right, of the younger generation, millennials and younger. As you and I both know, we have a problem in that many of our peers are not necessarily interested in policy prescriptions that come from conservative ideology or conservative values, or even limited government. So why do you think that is, and how do you think that CPAC has been able to speak to that in their panels and discussions this year?
God, I think that's very true, and I think part of it is not necessarily that they don't have those beliefs. It's just, I don't think there's a very refined marketing system that helps people who feel the way they do about certain policies realize where they align on the political spectrum. And so I think you see a lot of young people who have, let's say, beliefs in individual rights, civil rights, things of that nature, who don't really realize that they don't necessarily belong within a wing of the party that believes in big government, that believes in collective rights, and it's just that message needs to be brought to them. I mean, I hail from New York City, and having spoke to a lot of folks within, let's say, the Black Lives Matter rally, or people who care about issues of civil rights, police brutality, and things like that, and they don't actually have the opportunity to hear other voices or to speak with other people that can say to them, listen, this is where you actually fit in this spectrum. This is what you believe in, and you've been voting for folks for generations who don't support the things that you fundamentally do because they're just not giving another voice. So I think this is something that I think the conservatives and the Republican Party overall, over the longer term, need to look to, of not necessarily changing their policies, but looking at how they bring those policy messages to younger communities, and also communities that may not traditionally vote for Republicans or conservative candidates.
Well said. I think the problem with conservative values and millennial generations and younger is not a mismatch in priorities, right? It's not a mismatch even in the things that are important, that are shared important between the two demographics. It's articulating conservative values. Conservative values have not been marketed well. One of the things that I frequently say is that I think that conservative policies and values can actually better achieve the things that millennials and younger care about than big government policies. In the expo hall here, there's a stand that makes the case why the free market is the solution to climate change. Many of the panels today have been on the subject of black voices becoming more prominent in the Republican Party and among conservative platforms because conservative policies can better support their communities. How do you, or what have you seen this year at CPAC that has been doing just that, been articulating conservative values better and making the case that every solution to society can't and shouldn't come from the government?
Yeah, certainly there's been a lot of panels that go into a lot of the issues, as you've said, and a lot of it have highlighted solutions to problems that have been brought about by free market solutions. Obviously, the environment is one of them. A lot of it's been also highlighting a lot of the job creations that happen during the past 4 years, and how, I mean, look, in the industries that I'm involved in, where you have issues with chip manufacturing and other, big tech-related issues that are actually being exported outside of the country, there is a concerted effort to try to bring these jobs back to the United States and to push free market development, because a lot of these industries were created by entrepreneurs from the US who had that ability to run, access capital, build in sandboxes that allowed them to innovate. And hopefully the new administration won't stymie that or place political impediments upon that growth, because we are dealing with international competitors who, you look at China. China may be a communist country, but it's probably one of the most capitalistic I've ever been to, given that they're willing to do whatever it takes to make money and gain market share. And so we can't sit by the sidelines and think that there isn't anybody going to come in and eat our lunch, because I've been in places from South Africa to India to China, and there are, for every one young American coming up, there's 1,000 kids out there that would be willing to take their job at a fraction of the cost. So we have to make sure that we maintain our competitiveness, and the best way to do that is through free market innovation.
Well, that's right, and that term free market innovation really encompasses policy prescriptions that come from a very broad spectrum of sources, right? We're talking about solutions to some problems in society come from the family, or they come from companies or consumer choice. They can come from a government-private partnership. They can come from international cooperation. I mean, it seems to me that CPAC is almost like a policy prescription supermarket, right? The super Walmart of solutions for society, because we're talking about all of these problems that we face, and there are broad opinions here as to how these things can be addressed, and a broad source of solutions, as opposed to what might come from a more left-leaning conference where everything has to be coming from the government. How can we expand government to tackle this problem or be the source of this solution? So what do you think is going to be said? That's what we see here. That's what I've been noticing in the speakers. What do you think is going to be said about CPAC, rightly or wrongly, from the outside looking in? And what have you observed? Do you agree with that assessment of what we've seen here?
It's hard to know what the I'm not sure really how to answer that with regards to how CPAC will be perceived. I think one of the things that I think is very interesting, and maybe a little bit of a divergence from the question itself, is the fact that CPAC is even happening, right? And this kind of shows this kind of divided, kind of this division between what states are doing from a policy perspective with regards to COVID and reopening, and what's happening with regards to schools and economies, right? Obviously, CPAC normally takes place in the Washington, D.C. area, usually in Maryland. That was moved to Florida this year because of just the Maryland governor not allowing the state to reopen. And so the fact that this entire convention was basically moved down here, shows that certain states are open for business and certain states aren't, and how that dynamic persists going into the future. Because going on now, we're almost at the year anniversary of when this all started and the first shutdown occurred. There's a lot of people wondering, how is it that places like Florida are still opening and from what I've seen, thriving compared to where I'm from in New York City, where we're talking about potentially losing 90% of our restaurants, amongst other businesses. Are you going to have, the states that are open for business and the states are closed for business? Forget red versus blue, but open versus closed. And so I think, the fact that CPAC's here and even, keeping things moving again says a lot upon itself.
I think you're right. Actually, I think that speaks perfectly to what I was asking, which is perception versus reality, right? And CPAC itself is an example of shopping for policy solutions from more than one place. For example, CPAC is in a state that has done very well with limited lockdowns, with smart government, but limited government when it comes to battling the pandemic. And Florida's has able to been largely more open than the rest of the country. So that was the Trump administration's policy for the most part. It was localized efforts to do what is right for your population and your community to battle the pandemic. You've seen different levels of success. Florida's a success story there, and CPAC is the manifestation of that success. We're able to be here in Orlando, meeting in person, and everybody's being safe. We've both got our masks in our pocket, and we took them off right before we started this. And they've got people walking around monitoring masks and things, and for the most part, people are largely complying. I also noticed yesterday that Jim Acosta was walking around. There was a lot of people around him, right, from CNN, and in his.
I missed him, unfortunately.
Did you? It kind of seemed like he was really loving the limelight. And one of the things that came out of his social media later was that CPAC is here with the purpose of spreading the big lie around. And the big lie is that the election was stolen. It's a very overly simplistic and really inaccurate view of what has been said here in many of the panels. 5 of these panels have been on election integrity with a range of experts that have had varying opinions as to what election integrity is, the role it played in the previous election, and what to do about it. So we're seeing a nuance, of course, that is never going to be given to the panels and the discussion that's being had here. But what are your thoughts on that, and what's been your takeaway about the attitude here on election integrity?
I think election integrity overall is critically important. It amazes me that when you look at the issue of, and I'm not talking about necessarily this election, but you talk about, rigged elections or, misdeeds that occurred. This is something that's been, well documented throughout U.S. history. This is when you talk about even the civil rights movement, right? The whole issue of what one of the core elements that they were fighting about was not only people who were empowered to participate in the elections, but the actual counting of the votes itself. And the fact that this is somehow, kind of thrown completely to the wayside all of a sudden, it's amazing, because you look at issues of, let's say, and I've had the opportunity to live and work throughout the world. You look at places like South Africa, where Mandela was heavily a proponent of, folks getting out and getting registered, getting IDs, and being part of the electoral system, and countries in India where people live on pennies a day have some form of recognition of that they voted and they should have been there. And then you look at even the system that I'm very familiar with, let's say in New York City, where you have almost a pure opposition for anybody showing anything that they are who they are. And I'm not talking about this election, but in general, that you can almost do any other government service or any other function anywhere with less of accountability than you can when it comes to voting.
Well, Tim, thanks for speaking with me today. And, I think one thing that's been very obvious about this year's CPAC is that the conservative movement is incredibly diverse. There is a broad spectrum of individuals who call themselves conservative and want to find policy prescriptions and solutions for society from every demographic, old, young, every background and racial identity and gender. And I think it's different what we see here than what we hear about CPAC and what we might hear about the conservative movement. And this is something I'm interested in sharing with my peers. Not just the diversity of what makes up the conservative movement, but the diversity of ideas that make up our movement. Any final thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I think you're right. And again, coming from New York City, coming from a very urban area, I found that as you go into working class communities, when you go into Brooklyn or Queens, Staten Island, the Bronx, you really find that a lot of just regular folks, whatever country they come from, whatever racial background they associate, conservative values and the ideas that, from a policy perspective are there are really widely shared. It's just a lot of those people don't really realize that they're within that side of the spectrum. And it's largely because you have, in particularly very dense urban areas, a very antiquated one-party system. And so, especially within immigrant communities where folks want to come in and just be part of the system, build a career, build a family, and just have a better life, there's not really that desire to, buck the system, even though they may believe very differently from the leadership in power. And so I think as, you see demographic shifts towards big urban areas, at least you were before COVID, I think this is one of the challenges that's going to have to be met of how do you connect with the people that share your beliefs and then actually getting to vote for you from a policy perspective. So I think that should be one of the biggest things that is discussed at CPAC.
And it seems like it is.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, as you can see, Tim and I discussed some of the perceptions that we were hearing about CPAC while we were there. And of course, the continued and increasing diversity of the thought leaders that are presented on the stages at CPAC. And we also had the opportunity to discuss some of these topics and others, including criminal justice reform, with Distinguished Fellow Bernie Kerik at CPAC.
I wanted to get an idea of, obviously having served as the police commissioner of New York City, what your take is on what you've seen over the past years. Obviously there was quite a bit of civil unrest that came out of the protests, and where you see kind of law enforcement, particularly in the large cities in LA and New York City, going forward. A lot of the law enforcement communities, and I spoke to people both on the protesting side and on the, within law enforcement, and especially in New York, there's been quite a feeling of disenchantment within the entire profession. What do you think can be done to fix that going forward so that the young officers are actually, proud and empowered to do the job?
There's only one thing you need, and that's new leadership. Whether it's New York City or Minneapolis or Atlanta, Seattle, Portland, every one of these cities are run by Democrats. Every one of these cities are run by people that are far left-leaning, either Marxist or radicals. They've called for the defunding of police. They've called for the dismantling of the police department. Some have called for a complete elimination of police and prisons. At the end of the day, that creates anarchy. It destabilizes the departments. It creates chaos in the communities. And what you will see, and what we have seen, is major rises in crime, violent crime, shootings, murders, especially in these cities. In Minneapolis, they defunded their police, and here we are 3 or 4 months later. They had a unanimous city council meeting probably 2 or 3 weeks ago where they basically said, okay, we have to refund the police department. We need at least 200 cops ASAP. We probably need more. Why? Because the second they defunded, when you defund, you take away training, you take away manpower, you take away resources, equipment. When you do that, you're going to see major increases in violent crime and murder. That's what they saw, and that's what they have to address. And the shame of it is, the people that call for all this stuff, this defunding, 90% of the time, they're not from those communities. They're outsiders. They're these morons that sit in Congress, spouting out things that should be done. They don't live in those communities. They don't live there. They don't have to deal with the aftermath. The bottom line is, anytime you defund the police, you're going to see major spikes in crime and violence and murder. And the more you do it, the more you're going to see. And I'll close with this. From a historical perspective, nobody knows this stuff better than I do, or better than somebody like Rudy Giuliani does. We lived through the 80s and early 90s when crime was out of control in New York City. We left office. When I left, we were down 65% in violent crime, 70% in murder. It was an unparalleled reduction prior to Giuliani, and it's never happened since. But the bottom line is, it can happen. You can reduce crime and violence and murder with the right leadership. The problem is, we don't have that leadership in those cities. And as long as we have this democratic type leadership, this radical leftist leadership, you're not going to see reductions in crime. So if people want change, if they want safer and more secure cities, they're going to have to vote these people out and get the right people in.
Is there any
I'm a New Yorker myself, so I can, say firsthand of what it was like growing up in New York in the 80s and the change that came under Giuliani and the, what some have called the Republican Revolution that has made, New York City, at least for a very long time, almost like, a fantasy land where you can raise a family and go through Times Square safely and, go visit the M&M store and places that used to be, just places that were, full of prostitution and other drug dealing and other things like that. Obviously, I see it for myself, having just left there a few days ago, that we're kind of on that downward spiral. Are there any, like one policy change, aside from obviously a change in leadership, from a policing standpoint that you could recommend that departments consider doing going forward?
Honestly, no. There's no change that's going to happen without the mayor authorizing the police department to basically take the handcuffs off themselves, right? Your policies are dictated by the mayor. Right now, we have an extremely left-wing radical mayor in New York City. He doesn't really care about the people. He doesn't care about the communities, and he really doesn't care about crime, because if he did, the things that are happening now, they're easily fixable. The cops, the men and women in the police departments, they're going to do their jobs. They know how to do the job. They know what they have to do to reduce crime. But they need a leader. They need a mayor that's going to allow them to do it and basically hold off the radicals and push them out of the way if they get in the way and they try to get the cops to stop from doing their job. Bottom line is, unless you have a change of leadership, it's only going to get worse.
Time for one more subject.
One more.
Criminal justice reform. It's a topic that conservatives have actually picked up the ball on, and we saw great strides made under President Trump when he enacted the legislation or approved the legislation that he did and brought Alice Walker out in the RNC. What are your thoughts, and is this an issue that conservatives can own?
In all honesty, it's already an issue that conservatives own. The Democrats had tried to do this for years, right? Under President Obama for 8 years, and I was working with the Obama administration trying to get some of this stuff done. And I remember when President Trump got elected, people called me and they said, it's never going to happen now. Never going to happen. There's going to be no criminal justice reform. And the bottom line is, I was actually standing in the Oval Office with the president when he signed the First Step Act. Republicans, conservatives, they should own this issue. They should own this issue. They know how to get it done. It should be a bipartisan issue, but the polarization of politics these days, where the Democrats, they just don't want to work with a Republican, that's a shame, because people will suffer. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to focus on. Brett Tolman, former U.S. Attorney in Utah, Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee, and others, they know how to get this done. They can do it. We're going to need the Democrats to be a principal player in this, and I don't know if that's going to happen.
Great to be able to speak with Mr. Kerik, and there were other fellows from the London Center, president at CPAC, including DeRoy Murdoch and Gordon Chang, whom we hope to have in future episodes of Thought to Action to discuss their work and that which they discussed at CPAC.
So I appreciate your being able to get in there and mixed up with our folks, but let's go back for a moment to talk about, because you've made the point of media coverage. So, how would you term the actual presence of people like Jim Acosta at this event? And I want to link that to some of the comments made by our senior and distinguished fellows there at the conference.
So Jim Acosta was walking around for a couple of days, and there was a large crowd around him. They didn't have nice things to say to him, and of course that was the wrong approach. But I think he was almost trying to stir up those responses to create a story himself.
I'm sure that's not true.
Interestingly, Mr. Acosta likes to be in the news stories that he's covering.
No doubt.
I didn't actually see him doing any reporting. He was mostly walking around and arguing with other people at CPAC. On the whole, I thought the coverage of CPAC by many media outlets was blatantly dishonest.
Yeah.
Deceptively dishonest to the consumers of those outlets, because I've read claims that there was talk of that there was no discussion or debate that happened, which is not true. and then all types of things that were the supposed motives of CPAC goers that just is not true. For example, conversations about election integrity had nothing to do with restricting access to voting. In fact, I would argue on the contrary, that keeping an election safe and secure and free from fraud enables voters to have their democratic institutions more accessible, right? Because their vote is worth what it's supposed to be worth: one person, one vote. So
yeah,
it was I think it was a very dishonest coverage.
To cover that point real quick, I mean, today, as we're taping this, there was the announcement that the Georgia legislature is going to require for any absentee voting an ID. Now, there's huge protests in the capital, state capital, over this new requirement. But I think everybody understands if you want to buy a gun, you want to buy alcohol, you have to have an ID. So I cannot believe that any sane person would believe that requiring an ID is racist or somehow discriminatory, since every single act within our civilization requires some form of ID be presented. I just don't understand how that they can believe that fraud's a good idea if you really want to have one individual vote once and that vote be counted as cast within the context of any given election.
Right, and I think, voter ID was one of the policy recommendations that was made, but there were others that summarily amounted to simply following the law on the books when it comes to elections. There was presentation by various centers that are advocating simply to have the existing law followed when it comes to elections, which includes the window within which you can vote or have your absentee ballot counted, postmarks and things like that. So these aren't wild, extreme prescriptions for election integrity. This is following what's already been established as law and enforcing that law.
So let's talk about the idea of rule of law beyond our borders, because one of the things that you've mentioned in the past is there's a larger movement, a global movement, that relates to conservative values, conservative thoughts. Right. And I think we've established from our discussion so far, Bryan, conservatism is not about any radical ideas. To the contrary, it's actually about establishing an adherence to the existing laws, as well as ensuring the integrity of any given process that involves decision making regarding voting or actions of the government. I don't see how any of these are extreme or radical. But what is going on regarding international movements, regarding these basic concepts relating to the conservative movement?
Indeed, conservatism is about preserving and conserving the rights and liberties that members of a society under a government that they've agreed to form have and hold. And that has broad international appeal, not just within the American context, but in other areas of the world. Right now, there are a lot of Asian countries that are looking to learn from their histories, and of course, they're watching what's happening in neighboring communist China and interested in conservative values to address some of these concerns. CPAC, the Korean CPAC, was something that was launched for the first time last year, and there was certainly a number of Korean thought leaders and speakers at this American CPAC. And there was also talk of CPACs being launched in Australia and Japan in the coming year, and prospects in India. So conservatism, of course, has international appeal, and we're seeing that manifest in these other CPACs being launched. And again, the broadening diversity of speakers and voices that we see at CPAC.
Well, that's excellent. I think that's something that was not noted or adequately covered by the mainstream media. And I think it's a continuous purposeful deception of the American media to not actually reflect accurately those organizations, especially international organizations, which attend these events. So we've talked a little bit about what you observed. We talked about who was there. Talked a little bit about the fabric of who was there and why they're there. Tell me what your thoughts are regarding what should happen next. What is going to be, I think, the best course of action for the London Center and for other organizations and individuals who want to see the best for the nation?
Like I said, for the next 4 years, we're going to see from Washington solutions to society's problems or issues facing Americans that only come in the form of growing the size of government. Mm-hmm. We as conservatives and also those who believe in smart policy prescriptions, those who work for those, like the London Center, need to articulate that there should be a pool of solutions that is much broader than government. One that really is the Big Tent. We should reclaim and own the idea that values and policies that come from different sources of solutions other than government is the Big Tent way to address and approach the things that society faces. We should own these things, we should articulate them better, and we should market them in direct response to the failures that we're going to see coming from the government-only crowd that currently owns Washington.
So I'm sure you'll be able to explore this more in the process of going through and discussing what you observed and incorporating more about the fellows who attended the event. I look forward to the full interviews with you and those folks, as well as an expanded discussion with Gordon Chang, and maybe even bringing Bernie Kerik back to talk about some of this, because as you know, Bernie and I worked on election security issues, which we've not fully made the scope of which public, but something we should be continuing to develop and work on. And Gordon, as you know, Gordon has been sounding the alarm along with us and others relating to China and the national security threats which it's been offered. So we look forward to that. Is there any other closing ideas, Bryan, that you want to add to what we talked about today?
I'm glad CPAC exists. I'm glad that figures in the conservative movement get together to discuss ideas, to debate ideas, to engage in our own little public square there. The idea that the coverage of CPAC was as dishonest as it is, I think, is emblematic of the larger efforts that are happening to shrink the public square, to censor conservative voices and conservative thought leaders, to characterize or cast conservative ideas and values in deceptive and dishonest ways. So CPAC needs to happen. I hope people watch CPAC on YouTube or C-SPAN and watch them in full. The panels and discussions that happened between the big profile speakers were the bread and butter of what everyone was there for, to discuss ideas, and ideas, hopefully, that survive the discussions are those that have the greatest merit.
Well, Distinguished Fellow Brian Griffin, thank you for joining us today on
Thank you.
Thought to Action. It's great to hear from a qualified source the actual content of what happened, and we'll continue to explore that. And thank you all for joining us and watching today, Thought to Action. If you like this program and would like to see us extend our content, please join our Patreon community at patreon.com/Thought to Action, where you can preview Thought to Action before everyone else and see our shows ahead of time. And we also have our exclusive Ask Us Anything question and answer session that you can participate in. Also, please subscribe to Thought to Action through our YouTube channel. Monitor what we do via Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social media. And obviously, please check often the londonCenter.org website for our events and efforts that we put out there for people to understand and support. So Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, the president of the London Center for Policy Research, and we'll talk again real soon.